Just a moment ago, before the choir sang, Randy and Lynn Payne read the scripture reading for the day, taken from Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. It's a story that I reflected on with you not so long ago, and I'm going to really circle back around to it at the end of the message today. But it's a story that we talked about several months ago where we raised the question, was Jesus a racist? Or more specifically, was he ethnocentric? Because of the way he treats this Canaanite as she's described in Matthew's gospel. Mark's gospel, she's called a Syro-Phoenician woman. In Matthew's gospel, she's called a Canaanite because Matthew emphasizes Canaanites versus Israelites throughout his gospel. And when this woman cries out, seeking help for a daughter that she says is demonized in the ancient world, illnesses that they didn't understand, they attributed it to unclean spirits. So she was in desperate straits, and she cries out to Jesus, and Jesus ignores her. She keeps shouting, and the disciples want to get rid of her, so they ask Jesus to send her away. And she keeps shouting, and Jesus finally tells her, it's not appropriate to give the children's food to the dogs. Dog was a slur that Jews directed toward Gentiles, or in general, and Canaanites specifically, with that long history there. Eventually, she persists and says, Lord, with great humility, even the dogs desire to eat the crumbs from the master's table. And Jesus says, what great faith you have. And he said, your daughter is healed. That story leaves questions that are still open in many people's minds about what was going on with Jesus there. But at least we can draw from the story that by the end of the story, Jesus at least either is having that episode in front of his disciples to make a point, or Jesus is growing himself in his understanding that yes, even the hated Canaanites can demonstrate great faith. So perhaps we see Jesus with a change there in his own attitude, where he overcomes previous attitudes that, he had told his own disciples, only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, don't go to the Gentiles or Samaritans. Those good news is not for them. So in that story, we meditated on that a few weeks ago, and I use that only really as a backdrop that I'll circle around to, because I want to talk to you today about how we're still dreaming. I mentioned at the beginning of the service that tomorrow is a day when, at least since the year 2000, all 50 states recognize as Martin Luther King Jr. Day. His birthday is January 15th, and so the third Monday in January is set aside, at least since 1983, as a day to remember Dr. King's life, as well as specifically his efforts at promoting civil rights for African Americans. We're growing, we're getting better, we're moving forward, that's good. We've still got a ways to go. Right here in Lakeland, over the past year, we've been having a sometimes heated debate about a Confederate monument that stands in the center of Munn Park. It is set to be removed by January the 31st. Now, some people looked at that monument, and some people still do look at that monument as simply a benign way of remembering the noble sons of the South who died defending hearth and home. I disagree. I want to spend a little bit of time today reflecting with you on the monument, the history surrounding it, and why we as followers of Jesus must grow beyond looking at people either from the standpoint of simply their racial identity or their ethnic identity, and we must continue to rise above it and be a voice for those who still try to adhere to Dr. King's vision of a world, a dream of a world where we judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So I'm going to take a few moments today and tell you why I disagree with those who think that monument is simply a benign memorial to Confederate dead. You got to understand what was going on at the time that monument was erected. Really, what was happening when that monument was put there by the United Daughters of the Confederacy was they were trying to do what the South had been doing for some time, an exercise in revisionist history, trying to regain this so-called lost cause and put a new shine on it. It had been going on for some time, heatedly so since the end of Reconstruction around 1876. During this period of time that monument was established, it was one of the low points in the South regarding race relationships, or the lack thereof, between whites and blacks. And I want to talk about that subject today. I want to give you a few things by way of information and slides, because I think it's important that we get some visuals as well. Of course, everybody knows what the monument is, right? Now, that is not from 1910. This monument was put in Munn Square June 3rd, 1910. This photo is actually from 1915, but that's some of the United Daughters of the Confederacy that perhaps were present when the monument was established just 5 years earlier. There are no people of color in that photo. And I'm not talking about because it's black and white. These are people who established that monument June the 3rd, 1910. Why did they pick June the 3rd, 1910? Anybody know? June the 3rd was chosen because it commemorated the birthday of Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America. Did you know that? When this monument was erected by the Lakeland chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they chose it, as they said, to commemorate the noble sons of the South. There is an image there. This is what it actually says on the monument. Installed by the Lakeland chapter, United Daughters of the Confederacy, in memory of the noble sons of the South, A.D. 1910. In memory of that noble band who have crossed the mystic stream and are now resting now in that happy land where peace and pleasure reign supreme. Their heroic deeds will never fade from memory's brightest page, and their brave defense of country and home is left as a glorious heritage. Glorious heritage, really. Well, like many Confederate monuments in the South, it was erected to celebrate the lost cause of the Confederacy. It was a bad cause. I grew up in Alabama, grew up in the South. I'm well aware from my own studies of history how the effort was to revise history and to make it look like it was something other than it really was. Really, in the period of 1910, we're coming off a period of time after Reconstruction, 1896, the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the so-called separate but equal doctrine. We're further legitimizing from the highest court in the land the notion that you could have segregation and still have an equal society. Well, of course, we know the history of that. But that period of time also corresponds to something that was going on at the highest office in the land. Woodrow Wilson. He was a Democrat president born in the South. In 1912, he reestablished segregation in the federal workforce. That spread throughout the country. It further legitimized segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South. This is a step back. And it was done because there was tremendous pressure in the country, especially from the South, to really take back the ground they believed that had been lost during Reconstruction in the aftermath of the Civil War. It's a very difficult and an extremely dark time in our history. The 1910s have long been viewed as the low point of racial mistreatment of black citizens in the post-Reconstruction America. From 1877 to 1950, over 4,000 lynchings of black citizens occurred in 12 states across the South. Florida ranks first per capita lynchings in the entire South, per capita. Polk County ranked third in the state of Florida. The numbers vary slightly depending on which source you look at, but I've looked at some different ones. The range is somewhere between 18 and 20 black lynchings here in Polk County. first 20 years, from 1903 to 1921, the vast majority of them occurred. Now think about it. The monument was erected in 1910. On both sides, roughly 10 years on both sides, was the low point, if you will, of lynchings in Polk County. There's a lot of things going on. Anybody familiar with the film The Birth of the Nation? The Birth of the Nation. It was the first motion picture screened in the White House. It was Woodrow Wilson's White House. The Birth of a Nation. Let me read some of this. Is the actual movie poster, the film poster. It's the fiery cross of the Ku Klux Klan. D.W. Griffith's mighty spectacle, The Birth of a Nation. It's founded on Thomas Dixon's book, The Klansman. This motion picture screened in the White House created quite a stir. It portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroic in their efforts to suppress blacks across the South. The Klan, for a period of time during Reconstruction, had pretty much been defeated, but there was a resurgence after the end of Reconstruction in the South, and films like this, a film that was viewed in the White House. The filmmaker was a friend of the president, shown there, celebrating the horrifying history of white supremacy, and really the white supremacist terror that dominated much of the South during this period of time. It's a very, very dark time. There was an effort to normalize this behavior and to make it seem righteous. And this monument was placed there in 1910 on Jefferson Davis's birthday to celebrate this resurgent effort to recast the South as a lost cause that was a noble cause. The old Confederacy. It was not that. It was a white supremacist adventure from start to finish. And it displayed itself in some of the most wicked and vile ways right here in Polk County, across the state of Florida and the South. It was not good. I have a couple of other things to show you. This is from the Lakeland Public Library. This is a Klan gathering at Mulberry Church in 1958. That's 1958. There's another. Also from the Lakeland Public Library, Klan marchers burn a cross in Lakeland, September 1938. Black residents confront Ku Klux Klan marchers on Dakota Avenue in Lakeland, September 1938. Lakeland Public Library. The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Polk County was a hotbed of this kind of thing. It's not an accident. Not an accident that monument was there to make a statement. It's not benign. It's not something we simply just deny, ignore the history there. It comes within the context of one of the darkest periods of our part of the world. I grew up in Alabama, and I told you at the beginning of the service, in Alabama and Mississippi. Arkansas, up until 2017, celebrates tomorrow not only as a day to honor Martin Luther King Jr., but also Robert E. Lee, the premier general of the Confederacy. You say, why do they bring those two together? Well, the argument is Martin Luther King's birthday is on January 15th, and Robert E. Lee's birthday is on January the 19th. Florida still has Robert E. Lee's birthday as a legal holiday, though it's not observed. I don't know if you knew that. It's on the books. But in Alabama and Mississippi, it's still, you can choose to observe whatever. They still leave that option open. I don't know how many people still remember Robert E. Lee or think much about him, but I guarantee you there's a few, more than a few perhaps in Alabama, and I know some. So it's been a dark history, and I think it's important for us to understand it. There has been, and has been a systematic effort throughout the history of the South to simply whitewash some of the darkest, most evil. Well, it was a reign of white supremacist terror. Fortunately, we moved beyond it, and we should not act like we haven't. We have. We've moved beyond it to a great extent. There's still work to do, but part of the work is knowing our history. The good, the bad, and the ugly. The old saying, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We may not repeat it in the same way, but we may repeat it in other ways, more subtle ways if we're not careful, by simply ignoring what actually happened. And you know, the worst place to have a debate probably is on social media, but if you've read any of the stuff out there, a lot of it's just pure ignorance on display because people don't take the time to learn the actual history. I want to share a story with you. This is in the lake, was Kimberly C. Moore's article, posted originally May the 5th, 2018. That's this year. I'll read you a story about Lakeland and Polk County. This is in the context of her coverage of the broader story. Here's this story that I thought you might find interesting. The posse arrested Charles Crumley and brought him before a young white girl who said she had been attacked 2 miles north of downtown Lakeland while walking to school. She told her family that a black man had tried to rape her. The girl looked at Crumley, but wasn't sure, she said. He looked like him, but she couldn't say for certain that he was the one. The posse took Crumley to the Lakeland City Jail, which in February 1909, this is 1 year before the monument was erected, was located near Munn Park. Within hours, a large group of infuriated citizens showed up, overpowered Marshal R.E. Scripper, took his keys and grabbed Crumley, the mob seemingly intent on lynching him. They tied Crumley up, brought him to the scene of the attack, piled wood around him, and poured oil all over him. And this is a quotation, with the Negro all the time protesting his innocence, unquote. The mob was planning to force a confession from Crumley or burn him alive, or both. The girl's grandfather, quote, stood on a tree stump and pleaded with the mob, begging them not to burn the Negro, this is a quotation, as his granddaughter could not say positively that he was the guilty man, unquote. Polk County Sheriff John Logan was in Bartow when he received a call that a lynching was in progress in Lakeland. He rushed to the scene. The sheriff had no trouble securing the prisoner, the account reads. Without assistance, without drawing his gun, he passed the mob, untied Crumley, and took him back to town, and no one attempted to stop him. It was a remarkable story because as the case in near Lake County, town leaders were often a part of these mobs and even members of the Ku Klux Klan. Sheriff Logan put Crumley back in jail, armed deputies were stationed around the building. In those days, there was a regular train service many times a day and night traveling through Lakeland. When the night train arrived from Tampa, it brought a company of National Guardsmen to relieve the deputies. But the story didn't end there. The sheriff's posse, apparently unaware of Crumley's arrest, was still on the hunt for a man the girl had described. They wound up in Trenton, some 145 miles north of Lakeland, and arrested Jack Wade, who was also known as Jack Nader or Jack Wader. The man, the account stated, fit the description given by the girl. If Jack Wade was from Lakeland or was on the run, that fact has been lost to time. A quote-unquote deputy sheriff Scott went to Trenton, placed Wade under arrest, and started back to Bartow with him on the train. And what is now called Lake Alfred, about a dozen men boarded the train and took the suspect from the deputy sheriff. Wade was taken to the girl's home that night and positively identified by her. The next morning, he was found hanged on a tree. Charlie Crumley, still a badly frightened man, was released. There's story after story of this kind of thing. During that period of time, you're talking about 18 black men lynched or burned without trial through mob violence. Right in the middle of the period of time that monument was erected in Abraham Munn Park. So what am I saying about this? Let's go back to the scriptures. As I said to you, Jesus encountered this Canaanite woman, and his first response is not very encouraging. It's one of those texts where Jesus doesn't come off very well. Most people have said, well, maybe Jesus is just trying to teach his disciples a lesson. Indeed, that is a main theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew. I talked about it last week and the week before. Throughout Matthew, there is this theme that the good news is for all people, not just simply for Jew and Gentile, not just for Israelite and Canaanite, but for all people. And all nations are encompassed in God's love and God's concern. But we are reminded how important it is from texts like these, as well as our own history, that we do not allow our own racial animus and prejudice to blur our understanding of our own history. that there always needs to be individuals and groups of people who will look honestly and forthrightly at history and see what has happened and ensure that it does not happen again. I'm thankful, very thankful, that even over my lifetime, and I'm really, in many respects, a post-segregation adult of the South. I never went to a segregated school. My little hometown of Sullivan, at least it was the closest town to me in the farm country that I grew up in near Beaverton. The Weeks know right where that is. My little hometown of Sullivan, we had, my kindergarten teacher was Miss Metcalf. She was African American. In our town, we had 3 police officers, well, a chief and 2 officers. One of them was an African American when I was growing up. The local state trooper was an African American. We'd see him on the highways. You didn't want to have him pull you over, so you see him up close. But I grew up in an Alabama that was already changing. And there were pockets of Alabama that resisted secession and slavery and joined with the Union in a fight against the Southern Confederates, who they saw as they were, traitors and rebels against the United States government. But what am I saying today? I'm saying that it's important on this Martin Luther King holiday that all of us think about our own lives, that we think about perhaps ways that we've ignored racial injustice and racial insensitivity and racial animosity. We've ignored it, or we've tried to shoo it away, or we've tried to act like it didn't happen. It's very important that all of us examine ourselves, but then look out in our world and be a voice among the people we care about. Sometimes it just takes one person voicing in a group of people. When people are using language that's disparaging toward people of color, just one voice standing up and saying, wait a minute, I don't support that. I'm against that. That's wrong. Just one voice can make a difference. And when more and more voices speak out, we'll see more and more progress. I hope my children, if I ever have grandchildren someday, I hope they grow up in a world where they remember these bad old times as truly bad old times completely from the past. Based on the readings I've had, the last person to be lynched in Polk County was in 1970. Think about that. That's within my lifetime. Yeah, we've made a lot of changes, but we must not become complacent, and we must not try to revise or whitewash or overlook our history. Let's be like Jesus, and let's grow from our encounters and continue to look for ways to bring more people who have been marginalized and pushed to the edges, and sometimes far worse, make sure they have all the freedom and equality that is theirs before God and for the laws of this country. We're still dreaming. Let's not stop.